everyone for coming out. And we are very pleased to kick off this summer's lecture series with Chris Somerville, who's a world-renowned authority on plant cell walls, and he will discuss the development of cellulosic biofuels. Somerville, who joined Berkeley Lab's Physical Biosciences Division in 2006, is an award-winning plant biochemist who directs the Carnegie Institution's Department of Plant Biology, which is a nonprofit research organization located at Stanford University. He's also a professor in Stanford University's Department of Biological Sciences. As a strong public advocate of the potential of fuels derived from plant biomass, Somerville played a key role in helping Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley procure the BP grant for the Energy Biosciences Institute. He envisions that the knowledge of cell wall structure and function will facilitate the development of plants with improved utility as sources of renewable materials and as biofuel feedstocks. Somerville is a native of Canada who earned all of his degrees from the University of Alberta. His lecture today will present an overview of some of the technical challenges associated with the production of cellulosic biofuels. After his lecture, which will run about 50 minutes long, we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And we simply ask that you please wait until you get a microphone from me or somebody over there so everyone can hear your question. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Somerville. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk here. What I'm going to do is, in this brief overview, is give a very general overview of sort of what the rationale is for biofuels and what some of the technical questions are in a very general sense. So let me begin. If one asks people in the energy industry what the future of energy looks like, as you can see, to make projections to 2030, as opposed to today, you can see that the energy mix that they project looks very similar to what it does today. And that reflects all kinds of things, sociological phenomena. But what it mostly reflects is that we're not running out of fossil fuels. 85% of our energy today currently comes from fossil fuels, and it's projected to remain so for the foreseeable future. Obviously, I hope we can change that. And you can see that there is a projected increase in renewables, but it's not very substantial, and I think it's probably incorrect. Now, because we have been dependent on fossil fuels during the past century, it'll be no surprise to the people here that because of carbon loading of the atmosphere, we have climate change issues. So people like to say we're not running out of fossil fuels, we're running out of climate. And I think that's the sole driver for biofuels, in my opinion. The federal government feels slightly differently. There are strategic issues, and I think it does behoove us to offer alternatives to the government so that the incentives, for example, for certain aspects of our foreign policy might be different. Now, to understand what the challenge is with climate change, which, as I said, I think is the real driver for an interest in biofuels, I think this is a very informative slide that many people are unfamiliar with. What it shows is there's a kind of a log-log relationship between the per capita income and the amount of CO2 released per capita. We're up here at the top in the developed world cluster, and China is down here off the line, as you can see, and India is right there. So there's about 3 billion people whose economies are increasing at 8 to 9% per year, and obviously they're going to move up this curve. And you can see that because they're above the curve, what that really is reflecting is that, of course, on a per capita basis, they're releasing more CO2 per unit of economic activity than we are. So hopefully, as they move up the per capita income, they'll get more efficient. But there's no guarantee that that's the case because those countries are endowed with a lot of coal, which is generally producing more emissions per unit of energy. So, I'm not going to give a talk about climate change, but I guess everyone here will know that there are many projections of what it means, but a good projection from the Hadley Center suggests maybe 3 degrees by the end of this century. And to put that in perspective, it's projected that all the change, the increased mean temperature since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution are probably below 0.75 degrees. So that's a pretty big change, and it could get a lot worse. If we look at what the alternatives are to producing energy in a carbon neutral way. I like to begin with nuclear because it's just a very dramatic number, and that is, it's been projected because of the rate of increase in energy use, approximately 0.5 gigawatt per day. That's the rate of increase. The average nuclear power plant is 1 gigawatt, so if we wanted to just cap emissions where they are today using nuclear, we'd need to build a plant every 2 days for the next 50 years. I don't think that's a very realistic opportunity. So if you look at what DOE considers to be the other opportunities, all human energy use is about 13 terawatts, so that's like 13 terawatts per hour. That's our average use. You see, we could get about 4 terawatts from wind. That's 2 million windmills the size of 747s. And the number of windmills, in effect, actually don't even show above the line. So there is a lot of opportunity there. We've pretty much used what we can get from hydro. There's some opportunities for tides and currents, but many ecologists are kind of appalled by the idea because it has riparian consequences to the ecosystems in basins. And the geothermal is mostly in locations that are hard to access, Iceland and Yellowstone and New Zealand and places like that. So the big opportunity, if you consider all the possibilities except one that I'll come to in a moment, is solar, because we're getting about 90,000 terawatts per year. So I think it's about, 7,000, let's call it 7,000 times all human energy needs coming in from the sun. So the real challenge is to figure out how to capture the solar. And of course, Steve Chu, when he started the Helios project here several years ago, that was the rationale. And it's, I think, the correct rationale. So when one says solar, typically people think photovoltaics. And of course, photovoltaics are an excellent source if we could manufacture them. The science is not new, of course. I think Einstein got the Nobel Prize in 1923 for the photoelectric effect. To date, since that time, the total amount of photovoltaics manufactured is below 4 square kilometers. And to meet U.S. energy needs, we'd need at least 26,000 square kilometers. So there's quite a stretch between what we've been able to make so far and what we can do in the future. It doesn't mean that an organization like this can't solve that problem, but as Nate Lewis likes to say, you pretty much have to get photovoltaics down to the price of paint before they can be really cost competitive. So it's a stretch goal, but obviously something that the Helios group will focus on. The one thing that I didn't put on the opportunity slide is shown here, and that is, of course, the sequestration opportunity. So I think many people, a lot of biologists anyway, misunderstood all the enthusiasm about the hydrogen economy. I think what the hydrogen economy really means is shown here, and that is that it's a kind of business as usual scenario in which we take fossil fuel and reform it, strip the hydrogen from the gas stream, and sequester the CO2 in old oil wells or subterranean aquifers. And obviously this can be, in theory, produce a lot of energy. We use about, in fact, except for the transportation fuels, we could obtain much of the energy that we need in principle from this general approach. And in fact, there's a number of experiments going on worldwide to examine the feasibility of this. This is just an illustration of one of them, it's called Sleipner experiment, where in this case they're actually tapping a gas well that's contaminated with CO2, and then they separate the CO2 and the gas on the platform, and then they pump the CO2 at 1 million tons a year back into an aquifer at about 1,000 meters. And this seems like a very promising approach right now. It's far outside my expertise, so I can't really evaluate it, but I think unless someone can find something that's wrong with putting it in deep saline aquifers, it's going to be an important component of our future energy economy. And probably what's really going to happen, as I can understand it, is that there'll be reforming of fossil fuels in large sites, and then the hydrogen produced will probably be used to drive turbines to produce electricity rather than as a transportation fuel, unless someone can solve the storage issues associated with hydrogen. Okay, well, I want to come to where does biofuels fit into this, and I guess everyone here will appreciate this, although many people on the street don't get it, and that is that to come back to solar, in terms of the way one can really harvest solar, other than through indirect methods such as wind, we have photovoltaics and biomass, as far as I can understand it. I should say photoelectric chemistry, that is hydrogen production from photoelectric or certain materials might also be promising. Anyway, to come to biofuels, the essential equation, of course, is that the energy from sunlight is used to reduce carbon dioxide into polysaccharides. Those can be burned directly or indirectly, and the heat released can be used for work, so the CO2 cycles around. In principle, it's a carbon neutral source of energy. It very much depends on how you actually grow the plants as to whether that's true and process them, but I'll come to that in a moment. Now, if we ask how much can we make from biofuels, there's lots of calculations. This is the one I like because it's simple and actually not really open to discussion in some way. So we get about 90,000 terawatts. The 70% that falls on the water is hard to deal with. So we have about 20, let's call it 29% that we can put devices up and capture. If we captured 1%, that is, if we captured it on an annualized basis, 1% of the photons on the land, we would need 5% of the land to meet all human energy needs. Just gives you some sense. Transportation fuels are about 20% of the total energy use. So transportation fuels, 1% of the land, if we can capture energy at 1% efficiency. So here's a plant that does it at 2% efficiency. This plant is, this is Miscanthus giganteus. It's a plot that's growing on the University of Illinois campus. It's about 7 years old. It's never been fertilized and never been irrigated. It yields about 26 dry tons per acre. And this crop, or this plot, has been cut at ground level for the past 7 years, so there's no inputs. Once you put the plant in, you harvest it each year. So that 2%, of course, this plant underwinters, so actually the efficiency during the growing season is quite above 2%, because I'm calculating 2% on an annualized basis, and that's 2% means that's what proportion of the energy received by the sunlight on that plot of land you can recover by burning fundamentally the biomass. After you convert it to biofuels, it's about a 1% efficiency. So I think, to make it simple, if we could get 1%, if we could grow this thing on 1% of the Earth's surface, we could meet all human transportation needs on 1%. So that's why we think biofuels are promising. In tropical regions, there are plants that will produce harvest at above 4%. So it may well be that, in fact, we can get by with actually less than 1%. So if you ask, well, how much is 1%? This shows how we use the surface of the Earth. So you can see about 35% is not arable. We use 5% for cereals and about 7% for other crops. You know, I can't tell you with certainty that we can afford 1% of that, but it certainly is one of the questions that we're going to be looking at deeply and broadly here in the Energy Institutes during the next several years to really assess that question. Is there enough water? Is there enough land? And what are the consequences to the societies that are sitting on that land? My general opinion is we can afford the 1%. Now, in terms of, so I've given a kind of a very high-level thing. I want to now just talk a little bit more specifically about what are the types of biofuels. And obviously, there are various kinds. You can burn it directly, and that's actually quite efficient. I'll come back to that in a moment. You can make diesel from plants. That is, when the diesel engine was invented, it was actually run on vegetable oil in the first instance. Today, you can make methyl esters of the fatty acids, and those are generally excellent diesel substitutes. There's sugar to ethanol, and there's cellulose to ethanol. That's pretty much what it means today, although it might mean more in the future. In the context of biofuels, I think I mentioned that, for example, many plants, this is a cell of a seed of a plant, and all these large open areas actually are oil bodies. So many plants accumulate about 40% of the weight of their seeds as vegetable oil. Vegetable oil is typically a triglyceride. That is, there's the glycerol molecule, and you have 3 fatty acid esters, and so you can crack these and make the methyl esters of these fatty acids, and they're excellent diesel. So the U.S. Congressional Research Office has done an analysis of how much biodiesel we could make in the United States. We use 140 billion gallons of gasoline and a bit more than 60 billion gallons of diesel in the U.S. If we converted every ounce of plant and animal fat and lipid in the United States into biodiesel, that's how much we could make. So about 3.5 billion gallons. Now, you hear a lot about it in the press, and in fact, we have 65 biodiesel companies operating and another 50 in construction, and that's how much they're currently producing. It actually doesn't show above the line. So the press loves it, but actually, as a solution to our national energy needs, it's not a very significant thing. And that's because the magnitude of our demand for fuels is very, very large. So there's lots of locations where somebody has 20 million pounds a year of tallow. That sounds like a lot, and that can be directly made into biofuel, but it's a niche thing. It's not a national solution. So to make a long story short, at present, biodiesel is not a big opportunity on the national scale. The one exception to that would be that there are plants that are very, very unusually productive, and this is one that it only grows within 15 degrees of the equator, but this is an oil palm plantation, and at the crown of the plants, they make a kind of a fruit that's a lot like an avocado. So it has a stony drupe in the middle that's full of oil, and then a mesocarp, like an avocado. It's also full of oil. And these things will produce about 10 metric tons per hectare of oil. So this is a feasible source. And in fact, some billions, 9 billion pounds or so of this oil is made each year. And in fact, regional economies in Southeast Asia will use a large amount of this stuff. On the other hand, there's a lot of deforestation associated with expanding plantations of this, and so from a purely environmental perspective, it's probably not desirable. And in fact, Europe has been trying to go towards use of biodiesel. So in Europe, the cars burn mostly diesel rather than gasoline. So the European Union made a mandate that the diesel would contain about 4% biofuel, and that has resulted in increased planting of palm and deforestation. So one has to watch out what you wish for when you move towards biofuels. That's something we consider an undesirable environmental effect. I'm going to skip that. Now, in the U.S., biodiesel mostly means corn grain ethanol at the moment. There's been an incredible expansion in corn grain ethanol. You can see the curve here. And in fact, we currently have about 153 plants scattered across the Midwest, in which mostly owned by farmers' co-ops, in which corn grain, or the starch from corn grain, is being converted to glucose and fermented to produce ethanol. One of the reasons this expanded so rapidly is that the cost of production of a gallon of corn ethanol 3 years ago was about $1.05. Last summer, it was selling for $3.50 a gallon as an oxygenate substitute, and so it was incredibly profitable. I've talked with a bunch of farmers out there, and one farmer told me that he and his neighbors raised the $50 million to build a plant in 9 hours in their neighborhood. And then they paid for it in the first year. So, people say a lot of bad things about corn grain ethanol, but if you ask the people out in the Midwest, actually, they're pretty happy about it. And in fact, the acreage is going to expand pretty strongly because actually 9 million more acres this year alone into corn grain ethanol. And there is a subsidy for it, which is a bit perverse, to say the least. There's a 50-cent subsidy. But actually, I don't know how many know this, but the U.S. government subsidizes agriculture very deeply. And that subsidy went down by $6 billion last year because the increased demand for corn grain ethanol increased the price of corn from about $2.15 to last summer about $4 a bushel. So the whole agricultural industry has become a lot more profitable because some overhang in the commodity supply is now being soaked up by this. There was a question back here. Okay, we'll come back to that. Well, it's probably well known to this group that in terms of a solution to the climate problem, corn grain ethanol is not a very good solution. Colleagues here at Berkeley, Dan Kamen and Alex Farrell and others have calculated that the net energy return on corn grain ethanol is probably 1.3 at most, meaning that a lot of energy goes into, if you look at all the life cycle costs of growing corn, a lot of energy goes into growing, processing it, and you're not getting much of a net return. Of course, so from that perspective, it's not very attractive. There's also an upper limit to how much can be produced. So it's not really known what that is, but it's probably in the 15 billion gallon range before the price of corn as feed starts to compete with the price as fuel. And it's a very important thing to understand that we've just experienced, or we're in the midst of experiencing, a historic event in some ways in which the price of a bushel of grain and a barrel of oil and a ton of coal and a board foot of lumber at the very least, have come into some sort of equilibrium based on the BTU value of those things. So for the last 2 generations, farmers have not been able to make a living, or an unsubsidized living, selling food, because at least grain, because there's been a serious oversupply. Today, farmers are making money because the value of the grain is valued on the BTU content. And that's what will actually anchor the eventual food price. So food prices are going to go up, there's no doubt. But they're not going to go up indefinitely, because you can't value the grain at more than the equivalent value for a barrel of oil after some conversion factor. So when we look at, as it probably is widely known here, the government has called for getting 30% of our transportation fuels from biofuel by 2030. And so to do that, we're going to need to move away from corn grain. We probably can't get more, as I said, than 15 billion gallons, and we need to get closer to 60 billion. So the future is with cellulosic ethanol. I'll come to what that really means in a moment. I first would just like to describe what the process is for making cellulosic ethanol. It's actually very similar to how we make corn grain ethanol. So cellulose is a composite of beta-1,4 linked glucose. Starch is alpha-1,4 glucose. So the essential steps are that one starts off with a bale of something, you grind it up. Typically it's boiled in hot acid, and what the hot acid is doing is partially hydrolyzing some of the polysaccharides so that the wall starts coming apart. Those partially hydrolyzed polysaccharides can be fermented after neutralization. And then the remaining solids are typically treated with an enzyme, let's call it cellulases, and the remaining sugars released by that are then fermented to ethanol. So that's the essential process. And this process has been working. People say it can probably be done for somewhere between $3 and $4 a gallon today. But it's rather inefficient, to say the least. So there are critics of the technology here on campus. In fact, Tad Patzek and Dave Pimental have published in the past that have calculated that this process is actually energy negative. And it's important to understand what they're really saying, because there's some truth there's some controversy about the degree to which their calculations are correct, but the fundamentals are correct. However, it's important to see where the problem is. So they would admit, at least in this paper, that if you just grow and burn a crop like switchgrass, you can get a 15-fold energy return. So what they're saying is, it's not in the growing. It's not that you can't grow and harvest and burn plants. That's fine. That's in net energy positive. But if you subsequently convert that to biofuel, they would calculate it consumes 45% more energy. And the reason is there's a lot of steam and electricity goes into the current method. That is, boiling in hot acid involves in putting a lot of heat in, as does the distillation and various other manipulations of the stream. So what that really means to me is that we need a substantial process improvement, and I think that's where all the real opportunity is in this game, or most of the opportunity is to really look at the process and understand it. I would have to say, in fairness, Dan Kamen and Alex Farrell claim that actually because if they reuse the heat differently in the overall process, they would claim that cellulosic has about a 5-fold energy return, even with current or slight improvements in technology. So what's the problem? Why is it so difficult to make energy from biomass? So this is a section of a pine board, and I don't know if everyone really understands what plants are made of, but let me just say they're mostly made of sugar. So if you look at a cell wall, so when you look at a pine board like this, of course these are the cells, and the energy space is, in this case, it's just air, but in a live cell it's mostly a dilute salt solution. The cell walls themselves, if you look at them in a transmission or a scanning electron microscope, you see this kind of very complex network of polymers, and those polymers are, the principal component is cellulose, which is a very long, let's call it 10 micron long polymer of about 36 chains of beta-1,4 linked glucose that are hydrogen bonded to each other to a very insoluble and very tough material that wraps around the cells. If we look at it in a slightly different context as shown here, so now I've sort of got a very kind of stripped down cell wall in which what it's showing is that these cellulose microfibrils are made at the plasma membrane, and then they become coated with another polysaccharide called generically hemicellulose. So that's generally a pentose, a polypentose that hydrogen bonds to the surface of the cellulose microfibrils, and the hemicelluloses are usually branched, so they make a kind of a furry surface that prevents the cellulose microfibrils from hydrogen bonding to each other. That in turn is somehow enclosed in this polymeric polyphenolic compound called lignin, which provides compressive resistance to the overall material. So that's in a way a kind of an artist's rendition of what the material looks like. Now the presence of that of lignin is really problematic and is shown here. And there's lots of it as well. About a quarter of the biomass can be lignin depending on the species. And what you see here is that there's an inverse relationship between the ability to enzymatically hydrolyze cellulose and the amount of lignin. So that, in fact, in native material, if you just throw enzymes at it, it's frequently not very degradable. So one of the challenges is to figure out how to get rid of the lignin, or how to at least open up the material so that it can be accessible to catalysts. And when I say catalysts, I can mean either enzymes or theoretically organometallic or some other form of chemical catalyst. Now we know how lignin is made, and in fact all the genes are cloned, and many experiments have been done over the years in which the synthesis or the modification of the monomers has been modified. I'll summarize it by saying it starts off with phenylalanine. It ends up with, the pathway ends up as a series of hydroxyphenyl or hydroxylated phenylpropanoids. These monomers are secreted into the cell wall of the plant, and then they're polymerized in a free radical reaction into that composite, or highly diverse polymer lignin that I showed previously. So if we simply reduce the amount of lignin, it causes a deleterious effect because the compressive resistance of the plant is damaged. So this is the so-called xylem tissue. It's the water-transmitting tissue of a stem of a plant. And here's what a mutant in which we've reduced the amount of lignin. You can see that the cells begin to collapse. And the reason for that is that the plants are blowing quite a lot of water out of the leaves because, for every molecule of CO2 that goes in, about 700 molecules of water go out. So there's a lot of evapotranspiration from the leaves. That's pulling a water column up through the vascular tissue of the plant. So it's under negative pressure, if you like. If it's not strong, if the walls are not strong enough, they collapse, and that's why you see that effect. And that has a strong effect, negative effect on growth. So we sort of know that it's not just possible, well, we know it's not possible to simply get rid of lignin. I'm just going to skip that for a moment. So we think that the kinds of solutions that might allow us to modify the processing of lignin are something like the following. Because lignin is made in a free radical process, we know that compounds like this, dimeric compound, become incorporated into lignin. You can feed these kinds of materials to intact plants, and then this stuff just gets incorporated into live developing cell walls. And that's because it's not enzymatic. It's a free radical polymerization reaction. So we think that compounds like this will also be incorporated. And this molecule, rosmarinic acid, has the beauty of having an ester linkage there, of course, which is very easily hydrolyzable, either enzymatically or chemically. So we think that there's the future in this general area is to develop plants that make a new class of lignin precursors that can be removed by more benign methods than present. To give you some sense of how tough lignin is, lignite, coal, is used as the same root because it's a principal component of coal that's very, very durable. Additionally, so lignin is one class of problems, and I would say I proposed one kind of a solution or a type of solution, and that is to modify the plant. But it'll be obvious to everybody here that the other kind of solution is to find new kinds of catalysts that can hydrolyze lignin. There are many organisms that do it naturally at some rate, and they're generally it's generally done with manganese peroxidases that catalyze ring cleavage, and so. In the new institutes that we're developing here, we expect to have some activity investigating that kind of enzyme, and I'll come to that in a moment. Another problem is that the cellulose itself is very recalcitrant to hydrolysis. First of all, the material is big, so if you just kind of model how big 36 glucans are relative to a globular 50 kilodalton protein, that's about the scale of things. And because the glucans are hydrogen bonded to each other into a very kind of monotonous surface, it's actually very difficult for enzymes to oppress an active site to make a cleavage. And the kinetics of these cellulase and interactions with the substrate are very, very non-linear and difficult to understand. So I think one of the interesting opportunities is to do high-resolution imaging of the process, actually. I think some single molecule imaging even of what a cellulase interaction looks like and how it proceeds is going to be informative. Also, I think some molecular modeling actually will also be potentially promising. So there's been a fair amount of work on trying to identify cellulases, but actually I think most of the work has been done from work that sort of began back in the Carter era when there was a little blip of interest in this during the first oil shocks. And today there's a new opportunity to explore the resources in the natural world. So by doing high throughput DNA sequencing, so perhaps it'll be known here that at the JGI there's a project, for example, to examine the genomes of the roughly 100 species or so of bacteria that do digestions in the termite gut and also, of course, in the rumen of ruminants like cattle. We need to explore those things. We need to go and explore compost heaps and forest floors to find out what's happening in those environments. If you go to a forest, a tropical forest, the soil is only a few inches deep, and yet there's a lot of biomass standing there, and I think we need to really understand how that biomass is turning over and identify the enzymes that are most involved in that. Obviously, today it's also possible to do, at least explore the possibility of improvements through rational design or protein evolution. And I think a big opportunity that hasn't really been explored is to try and develop synthetic organic catalysts for both polysaccharides and lignin. For some reason, this seems to be a very unexplored and undeveloped thing, and I hope we're going to be able to support quite a bit of work on that area here. There's also, I think, new opportunities, the new technologies that are available, or the relatively new technologies for high-resolution imaging and protein modeling and manipulation may allow us to understand how kind of a nanomachine called cellulosomes operate. So these are complex, multifunctional complexes that are attached typically to the surface of bacteria and which attach themselves through cellulose binding modules to the surface of the substrate and exhibit improved activity relative to single enzymes that are simply secreted into the environment. And I think I don't think it's really understood why these multi-subunit enzymes are really so effective, but one of the possibilities is the substrate itself is very, very complex. If you just imagine in your mind what a cellulose microfibril looks like during the process of hydrolysis, you'll imagine that it doesn't happen in a very orderly fashion. It's likely to become highly pitted and then highly fragmented. And all those molecular surfaces represent a very heterogeneous substrate that may require, or almost certainly requires, a family of enzymes rather than a single enzyme. And I think a lot of thinking in the field has been dominated by big enzyme companies that are selling enzymes into kind of very narrow niches, such as clarifying fruit juices and making genes look slightly worn. And so I think a slightly more sophisticated approach may really be very productive. Another big opportunity, or in fact an essential need, is related to the fact that the hemicellulose is mostly not glucose, and therefore we need to have organisms that can ferment about 6 of the major sugars. This slide just shows xylose and glucose, which in fact xylose is the second most abundant sugar. And in fact pathways are known and a number of organisms are known that are able to ferment both hexoses and pentoses. But in general, these organisms are not yet adapted to large-scale industrial fermentation. And so we need to explore which organisms are really optimal for the likely process. Ideally it would be a thermophile that's also somewhat acid resistant would probably be the best. And ideally, what we would really like is to actually be able to have an organism that can not only ferment the various sugars, but can simultaneously produce the enzymes required to break down the biomass. So that's what's called integrated bioprocessing, and there's a lot of interest in the degree to which we can integrate all the steps into a single organism. Probably not in my lifetime, but as a long-term research goal, I think it's where the field is headed. Finally, I think the other big bucket of opportunities is sort of related to the fact that although right now the industry is, at least here and in South America, is focused on ethanol, ethanol is not a very good fuel for a number of reasons. One is it's miscible with water, and so it absorbs water into neat solutions and then becomes somewhat corrosive, and so it creates problems with the distribution network. And a second is that we have about 240 million cars in the United States. Only about 5 million of them can burn more than 10% ethanol. And so to meet the Secretary's goals, actually, there's a huge infrastructure change required if we were really going to go to 30% of our transportation fuels being ethanol. It may well be that we end up doing that, but from first principles, a better solution would be to make a fuel that's a lot more like gasoline than ethanol. One of the reasons for doing that is that suppose we were able to make something that was, let's call it octane, or instead of ethanol. Well, octane will partition out of the aqueous phase, and so the energy that's required to distill ethanol from a broth goes away because the fuel would partition out spontaneously. And of course, we wouldn't have the whole infrastructure problem if we were able to make things like octane and decane or actually any of a wide variety of hydrophobic materials. And indeed, when you start looking from that perspective, many organisms make compounds that could be of interest. Plants, algae, and bacteria synthesize alkanes, alcohols, and waxes that are, not to mention things like terpenoids, isoprene-derived compounds, that could be excellent fuels. And so another big initiative, at least here at Berkeley, is going to be trying to understand how these organisms make and secrete hydrophobic compounds. In general terms, not very much is known about this. Even though we know a lot of organisms that make alkanes, and it's not very surprising in some way because there's a class of enzymes called decarbonylases that can remove the carboxylic acid function from fatty acids, which all organisms make, and the result is an alkane. However, no one has ever purified a decarbonylase. So to give you some sense of what we mean by a real opportunity, there's an important class of enzymes that's been known for 30 years, still not purified and no genes cloned. And so that seems to us like an opportunity that is ripe for picking. So what I've tried to say so far is if it really come down to what it is that needs to be done to make progress in biofuels, first of all, we don't really have to make a huge leap. If it's true that we can make them for $3 or $4 a gallon today, a threefold change in the cost of production is all that's really necessary to completely, maybe even only a twofold change in order to make it actually more attractive than fossil fuel as a source of transportation fuels. That seems to me like the kind of goal where a series of incremental improvements can work. And when we look at what's really required, it boils down to four things. We need to probably modify the plant composition, at least in the long term, to minimize the energy required for depolymerization. We need to make better catalysts for the depolymerization. We need to be able to ferment all the sugars. And ideally, we'd like to make something other than ethanol. Of course, there's a lot of complexity under those sort of broad goals, but that's what it really boils down to. Now, as to whether we can really do it, I started off in the beginning saying, yeah, we can do it on 1% of the land. I'd just like to briefly touch on what the practicalities are. The DOE and the USDA did an inventory a couple of years ago in the United States where they went county by county and looked to see what was being grown and how land was being used and what the climate would support. And they concluded that actually we could make from existing inventory with relatively minor improvements in productivity. They made some projections about, for example, that we could get 8 tons per acre on the 40 or 36 million acres that we pay farmers not to farm, and that we could use half the corn stover without having a deleterious environmental effect and so on. With some assumptions, they concluded that we could get 1.3 billion dry tons in the continental US, and that's we can get about 100 gallons per ton, so that's about 130 billion gallons. So actually that's about twice what the Secretary's goal is. So it could be out by a factor of 2, and I think it's an indication at least that there are substantial resources here. There are some problems, however, and one of the problems is, for example, this assumption that we can remove half of the stover. In fact, when people have actually looked, such as Ken Vogel, a USDA scientist in Nebraska, at what happens when you take away half the stover is the stalks and leaves of the corn. The yields start going down after a couple of years, and presumably his speculation is that that's due to the fact that that not enough carbon is being left on the land to support the microbial systems in the soil that mobilize nutrients, although it's not really known. So this needs study to see what this is really due to. And a likely way of studying this is, for example, to start sequencing, doing metagenomics on the microorganisms underneath, different ways of cropping. Let's call it the light blue and the dark blue bars, to see if we can see what it is that's actually changing in the soil during these kinds of cropping regimes. It does raise a really important class of questions, though, and that is the degree to which this can really be done sustainably. Obviously, the industry cannot develop, and we wouldn't want it to develop if it's something that will actually be harmful to the soil. Most people, perhaps it's only the circles I move in, but at least most of the people that I'm collaborating with in one way or another in thinking about this, we tend to think that, in fact, that this scenario is not correct, that probably we're not really going to use residues, that in the end we're going to end up using dedicated energy crops such as miscanthus, which I already introduced, and switchgrass, which the President introduced. There's a number of perennial C4 grasses that seem probable to us as dedicated energy crops rather than focusing on residues per se. These crops are environmentally very benign. The Europeans studied miscanthus for 10 years in a very large project at 16 major sites all the way from Sweden to, in the north, to Greece and Portugal in the south. And actually this is a slide from one of their studies showing harvest of the miscanthus in the winter in this case. And one of the many things that's attractive about them is that, let me see, what have I got here? Yeah, is that these plants, as perennials, they have a deep taproot that persists throughout the whole life of the crop, up to 30 years in studies in Europe. And actually that root continues to load carbon into the soil. So instead of depleting soil, these perennial grasses actually load carbon into the soil. Because they withdraw their nutrients back into that root at the end of the season, so you can see one of the advantages of doing it after they're dead is that in the process of dying, they actually withdraw their nutrients back into the perennial root, something that annual crops like corn don't do. And altogether, these features of the perennial C4 grasses make them very attractive. They also have much higher yield because this is the yield curve on an annualized basis for corn. That is, it starts off kind of slow in the spring and after it can be planted, and then it grows and declines in the fall. But these perennial grasses, because they're already established in the ground and have a huge reservoir of nutrients, pop up as soon as the snow blows off and get established very early. So the net photosynthesis under the curve is much higher for these grasses, and that's why we really favor them. So we think that in the future, depending on the region in the United States, there's certainly pretty much all the biomass will come east of the Mississippi. This is where the water is. I think I have a water, here's a water map, rainfall map. So you can see that, for example, that's the 25-inch line right there. And so this is where the water is. This is where the biofuel crops are going to be grown without irrigation, I predict. And they're going to be things such as switchgrass, miscanthus, but also some woody species. All the woody species use a lot more water. So typically a plant like poplar will use 3 times as much water per gram of biomass as a C4 grass like miscanthus or switchgrass. So wherever the terrain will support the C4 grasses, that's what we're going to be using. But in rough or rocky terrain, the trees are really the only option, and I think we'll see dedicated woody species in those regions. I think I've already kind of alluded to these things, that We consider the dedicated energy crops to be environmentally benign. The late harvest supports biodiversity. We envision that they won't be single monocultures, but in fact they'll be certainly genotypically mixed and probably mixed species to support biodiversity and to diminish the impact of pests and pathogens. There's lots of candidate species. I've only talked here about mostly miscanthus and switchgrass, but we're certainly going to be investigating a wide variety of species. And they have very low, or actually very low fertilizer, and essentially no chemical inputs except in the first year. When they're getting established, one has to use a herbicide to allow them to get started. We have a lot of research goals, and I don't have really time to talk about those things today. I just want to mention briefly, there is a question as to whether farmers will adopt these, and my colleagues and I in the EBI have already started talking with farmers, and in general terms, the farmers are very enthusiastic if it's something that is good for the land and is good for their pocketbook. Our calculations are that at $50 a ton, growing miscanthus at only 15 tons per acre, so remember I said that we're getting 25 in Illinois, miscanthus can be more profitable for farmers than corn. So we actually imagine these perennial grasses displacing a certain amount of the corn acreage in the future. By the way, $50 a ton, that's 50 cents a gallon for the feedstock costs. I think it may well be that in the end of the day, we'll pay farmers even more than $50 a ton, but one can see that economically it works. So my conclusions would be, I can't see why biofuels shouldn't be an important part of our carbon neutral energy economy. I don't see any insurmountable problems. I mostly see opportunities. And I think that this, developing biofuels really taps into what I would call a revolution in mechanistic biology. And I only had time to allude to a few small aspects, but I hope it gave you some sense about what the general directions are. I'd now like to just sort of briefly mention a couple of things about the Energy Biosciences Institute. So I hope everyone here knows that we recently got a $500 million contract with BP in a three-way, or actually a four-way relationship, including the University of Illinois. And that institute is going to pursue pretty much the kinds of things I talked about. Additionally, we're going to have quite a large activity in what I'm going to call global socioeconomics, because when you start thinking in terms of changes to an industry that's on the scale of the energy industry, changing it has a lot of consequences. And we want to make sure that to the extent to which we can have any effect, that we try to steer it in a useful direction. And of course, our only real tool for steering it in some way is to not do those things that, to not even start things that we project will have a negative effect, perhaps on social equity somewhere in the world, or a negative environmental effect. But also, if we have some foresight, we may be able to influence policy, and policy can be very important in terms of how, for example, we may choose not to buy biofuels from certain regions of the world where we think a biofuel industry might create make social equity issues even worse, or stuff like that. We have a small activity in sequestration and enhanced oil recovery at the request of BP, and we're still trying to sort through what the possibilities are. Some of you may know we recently made a call for proposals to the EBI. We got more than 250 proposals from colleagues here in LBL, Berkeley, and Illinois. And we've been just going through the process. I've been reading full-time for the last 5 days, trying to read all these proposals, as have several other people here in the audience. We have a panel of 15 colleagues from the three organizations that have reviewed and sorted these things. And so during the next several weeks, we hope to begin to announce the first round of things that we'll support. I just want to mention to everybody, we're going to have it's a continuing process, so we're going to try and get this thing on the ground as soon as possible and fund some activities, but next year we'll have another call, at least one, and we envision actually having a call every year for the next 7 to 10 years. So because we envision that people will continue to evolve new ideas and new opportunities will evolve, and so we're going to try and manage the funds in a way that allow us to invest in new ideas as they emerge. The reason that we made a partnership with Illinois is kind of shown here, and that is Agronomy and biomass productivity or production and related things are very important. Berkeley LBL is not a very strong environment for those activities. By contrast, Illinois, they have 6,000 acres on campus, and they've actually given us 300 of those acres to develop a so-called energy farm where we're going to grow a wide variety of plant species and study their agronomy and production characteristics. You know, I've been speaking about the EBI as though it exists, and in fact it doesn't really exist. So BP and Berkeley are still in a discussion about the terms of the agreement. Their goal is to get it now done by the end of July. So as soon as the opportunity arose, we started the organizing committee, or what we call the management committee, started organizing because we've been trying to put in place practices to sort of allocate the resources with the assumption that the deal is going to get done. And our goal would be to actually release money by the beginning of October, not starting in February. So hopefully within a month or so we'll actually have a signed deal, and but so far it looks very promising. And as I mentioned, the grant competition is currently underway, and we'll be announcing that soon. In terms of what it is that BP is going to get out of this and what it is we really promised them, the only thing I ever promised them is that we're going to give them a really deep insight into the field. And that sounds kind of trivial in some way, but actually it's really not, because when we looked at what it is we would do in the EBI, we found there were 25 disciplines or 25 distinct research areas that we wanted to support. And it reflects, for example, the fact that there's important questions in synthetic chemistry and in chemical engineering and microbiology, in socioeconomics, in agronomy, in mechanical engineering. There's a large number of different disciplines. And so what we're really trying to do with the EBI is actually compose a group of colleagues with expertise in all of those disciplines. And the way we're actually going to allocate the funds is we've sort of divided the pot among those 25 disciplines, and we're going to make sure that we fund them all so that we can create a group of colleagues who will interact and have expertise as a group in every aspect of the industry. And our expectation is that at the very least, since we're all fundamentally academics, that this will be a place where BP can come and get a clear answer to any question in the field. Additionally, of course, our goal is to try and create innovation and make discoveries, but the one thing I know we can do is inform them. And so whenever they say, oh, how is what are we really going to get out of this? That's what I keep telling them. Yeah, maybe some discoveries, but surely knowledge. And I think for $500 million, I actually think that's the most valuable thing that they could get, and the thing that we can deliver. Obviously, that same knowledge we hope will educate other scientists, so we expect to have a lot of workshops and educational activities here during the coming years. We just sponsored the first workshop on multi-scale imaging, and we hope to have many more. And I would invite anyone here who wants to organize a workshop concerning an aspect of the bioenergy equation to contact the EBI, because we're making grants available for that. And similarly, we would like to support seminars. So if you want to invite a seminar speaker to come and give a talk in a specific area, we would like to make funds available for that, because I think one of our goals is during the next several years to try and educate the group about what are all the issues. Obviously, that's related to our goal of generating a new generation of students who actually understand at least many of the aspects of this. I think I'll just skip through this and say that the way that we're organizing the EBI is that there's a governing committee. So it's kind of organized like a startup company in some way, in which there's a board of directors that has representation from the lab and the academic institutions and the company. So that's the board that approves the budget. And then there's a kind of a management committee, and then hopefully the management committee will implement the activities. And we're just beginning to hire some administrators to help us do the paperwork. I've already kind of talked about that. The final thing I guess I wanted to say was, of course, I guess everyone here knows that the lab, Steve Chu raised quite a bit of money for a new building. I couldn't quite figure out where to place it, but it's right below the foundry, wherever the foundry is, somewhere here, I guess. I'm on the design committee for the building, so I need to know where it is. But when it's built, about half of the building will be, actually, here's a kind of an old, already obsolete drawing of where it is. So there's the foundry. The building will sort of look somewhat like that, and that half of it is scheduled to be the EBI. At the moment, we're trying to renovate Calvin and one floor of Hildebrandt, and that's where the EBI will be for the next 3 years until we can actually move into. So we hope to have this building built by the summer of 2010. And it's programmed to hold 500 scientists at present. So that's the future as I see it. And I think I'd like to take any questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Yes, I had questions about two of the calculations you mentioned. On one slide, I think when you talked about the going from the cellulose to ethanol, you said that someone had published a calculation that you only get out 45% of the energy that you put in.
No, actually they're saying you go 45% negative. I think the Patzek and Pimentel paper?
Yes.
So they're saying it's net negative, actually.
Negative. And then you quoted someone else that calculated you get 5 times.
5 times. So Farrell, if you look, there was a science paper published last spring claiming a 5-fold net energy return.
So is that so that's a factor of 10 between those calculations?
Approximately a factor of 10, yeah.
And so, I mean, as a physicist, I guess, I mean, since there's such a factor of 10 is enormous, and that's with current technology. And so I guess it's hard for me to then believe future projections that this is going to be a very important part of solving the energy problem when there's a factor of 10 disagreement about what current technology does.
Well, you should read the paper and come up with your own conclusions as to which of the calculations is correct. So one was done by some physicists, and one was not. So the one that calculates a 5-fold return was done by a group of physicists. So. In general, people claim the net energy return is probably going to be at least 10-fold. And the difference in the calculations relates to how energy is reused. So modern engineering, as you know, you do. So in the Pimentel, as far as I can understand, in the Pimentel-Patzek calculations, they add up all the energy inputs, and they don't calculate any energy recycling, which in modern engineering, you know, it's pretty efficient energy recycling. So heat in particular, right? Yes?
What is contractually, what is Berkeley Lab's contractual relationship with BP in comparison to the UCB and the University of Illinois? For example, is all the money coming through one institution and then being distributed?
Yes, Berkeley is the lead organization, and LBL and Illinois are subcontractors to Berkeley, and it was organized that way to, well, I'm not involved in that aspect of it, but it was organized that way to allow a complex discussion between 2 entities rather than 4, and anyway.
A question, what percentage and what kinds of information, of this information developed by the EBI is going to end up in the public domain, and what part will be somehow locked up in various proprietary ways?
Yeah, all of it, there is 2 sides to the EBI. So Berkeley agreed that BP can post or some scientists on the site. And those scientists, we have no influence on whatever it is they do. However, the funding that we're allocating to Berkeley and LBL and Illinois researchers, all that will be in the public domain. There are no confidentiality restrictions. It's being imposed on it whatsoever. The one exemption is that I think whenever a paper from a work supported by the EBI is ready for submission, the administration wants a 30-day review of the paper for patentability, but the administration of the EBI cannot alter the paper in any way. So there's no restriction, I would say.
I see the ecological benefits of doing, not a monoculture, doing diverse species within the plot. A couple of questions within that. Are you talking within a certain 500-hectare plot of doing like a grid pattern of here's one species, here's another species, and interspersing it that way? Or will it be a pure multi-species plant, in which case, what's the cost in harvesting? Because if you've got a monoculture, obviously your harvest costs can be a lot more streamlined. What's the cost-benefit analysis on doing multi-species and then trying to harvest that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's what's prevented the use of what they're called multi-lines in traditional field agriculture, is that because those crops, the harvesting time is crucial, it's always, and also the process, it's always been difficult to have multiple varieties. But because these perennial energy crops are harvested long after they're dead, harvesting time is not a real issue, and so at present the vision is that these crops will be just randomly interspersed. I mean, the species will be randomly interspersed, not in alternative crop or blocks or something like that.
Okay, so to follow up on that, today the corn ethanol model is you have lots of subsidies and you have a ridiculous boondoggle for something that won't work and is going to cover a huge landmass in monoculture. Now, what we want to be is we want to have a sustainable agriculture that doesn't have too much fertilizer input. You plow stuff back into the ground. You have animals that contribute to fertilizing ad nauseum. It still seems like your proposal is still enormous land use of, okay, now instead of a monoculture, it's a triculture. I think you said trees and switchgrass and the other one. Mm-hmm. And again, still covering a huge amount of land in very intensive farming.
I don't think it's intensive. In what respect is it intensive? What do you mean by that? In a forest that would be in the northeast, there would be hundreds and hundreds of species on a single acre of land. Here in your system, there would be 3. That's true. That's probably right. I mean, there'd be a finite number of the most productive species. I think that's true. In order to minimize land use, you have to maximize the productivity per acre. So our goal is to get the most highly productive species. I mean, when I say productive, I mean, total biomass on a minimum number of acres. But in a realistic situation, the amount of farmed land would have to increase. It all depends, I guess. Well, here's a way of saying it. If we could grow miscanthus on the acres that will be used for fuel ethanol next year, we could meet the Secretary's goals. Okay? And actually our goal, so that is pretty much our goal, is stop corn ethanol, put those acres into a more highly productive species. And it'll be something that's environmentally a lot more benign than that corn ethanol. And so I think that's pretty much how it's going to fold out. In fact, I'm going to say a very radical thing, but I actually think biofuels are going to be grown on the most productive acres, not the least productive acres. And so, because many of the plants that we use for food can't actually utilize the intrinsic productivity of the land they're grown on because of intrinsic limitations to the productivity. So I think in the future, I know it's a radical thing to say, but I believe we're going to grow plants that are fundamentally, water limited. They'll grow to the amount of water that's available. For example, miscanthus does 26 tons, but sugarcane does 100 tons. That gives you some sense of what's possible on an acre. That's 100 dry tons per acre. So you could grow, wheat on that and get probably 100 bushels, 600 pounds or 6,000 pounds, I guess.
Can you comment, please, on scalability? All the research and development, measurements, predictions will be performed, I presume, on a small acreage. What about the impact of when you scale it to large production fields? What are the potential impacts or consequences? And what is the issue of scalability?
Yeah, we're very interested. I think I mentioned that we'll have a large socioeconomic component to the EBI activity. And it's those kinds of questions that we're really interested in. Is we want to have some forward vision of what does this really look like, and what are the environmental consequences on a large scale, and what are the socioeconomic consequences on a large scale. For example, if you start thinking, I didn't really get into what one of these biofuel plants might look like, but the scale of the plant is very important. If you have a 100 million gallon a year plant, I think you have to have, I'm going to say something like, I can't quite remember, it's roughly, let's say, 20-ton trucks every hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year coming into the plant, something like that. And if you really look at that and say, my God, are there enough roads to manage all these trucks day and night, you know? Those have become really important issues, and so no one has really studied that. We sort of know that they're there, and so we're going to be investing in that in the next couple of years. Because if for example, you decide that 100 million gallons doesn't make any sense in terms of what it would do to regional infrastructure, then you know the technology's got to be able to deliver a 25 million gallon plant that's economically feasible or something like that. You know, we can use that kind of, I'm going to call it socioeconomic, but it's broader than that. It's kind of mixed technical, socioeconomic, integrated assessment to really identify what high priority research goals are. If we need it to be small scale, that may be a different kind of technology than if it's something that we have to build, that we can just build to 100 million gallon scale. So those are some of the kinds of questions we're really going to investigate. Yeah.
I think that's about all the time we have for today, unless there's any other final questions. And thanks again to Dr. Somerville for that lecture.
Thank you.